Problems and Solutions of Consciousness and Perception by Michael A. Tioli. In the history of modern philosophy, few issues have been as discussed and debated as the scope and limits of human knowledge. Particularly, much of the epistemological speculation since Descartes has centered around a fundamental question. What, if anything, can I know of that which is other than myself, i.e., of the objective world? A subset of this question is, to what does my perception reach? What perceived qualities are subjective and what are objective? Over the last 500 years, there have been numerous attempts to answer these questions with various degrees of success. This presentation will outline the epistemological problems of consciousness and perception, and will examine several important solutions. Specifically, it will begin with Descartes and the question of escaping the Cartesian ego, proceed to the answers offered by Locke and Kant, and finally describe the solution founded on challenging the Cartesian ego altogether. René Descartes, often referred to as the father of modern philosophy, was the first thinker to coherently raise the problem of subjectivism. In his Meditations on First Philosophy, Descartes asked himself what he can know and how he can be certain of his knowledge. He does this through the application of methodic doubt, which is simply the process of questioning everything possible for the purpose of finding something unquestionable. Descartes begins with sensation, coming to the conclusion that in and of itself, sensory experience is supremely unreliable. As Professor William F. Lawhead in his book The Voyage of Discovery writes, quote, "Suppose your experiences right now are a dream that has not been interrupted. Descartes' point is that the most vivid sense experience does not give us the foundational belief we need because we have no way to distinguish it from a dream." Unquote. Or, as Kenneth T. Gallagher, professor of philosophy in his book The Philosophy of Knowledge writes, Descartes' fundamental question is whether, quote, the sensed entity is just as cut off from the independently real as is a dream entity, unquote. This line of speculation leads Descartes to wonder whether he is in fact deceived about everything he thinks he knows. However, after discovering that he can doubt the credibility of the senses and even the existence of the non-self, Descartes discovers that he cannot question his own existence. This is Descartes' famous cogito ergo sum, I think therefore I am. In other words, my senses might be completely deceiving me. The universe may be merely my own hallucination, but at least I know this one thing, I exist. Thought is predicated upon the existence of the thinker. Any attempt to deny one's own existence is self-refuting. This is the Archimedean point on which Descartes based his entire philosophy. We must begin with the self, which Descartes identifies as a thinking thing, and from there proceed to the other. Hence, Descartes' most fundamental principle is that self-knowledge is the foundation of all knowledge. The inevitable consequence of this is that the direct objects of human knowledge are ideas, and knowing is a purely subjective event. This is what is known as epistemological idealism, and it contrasts with epistemological realism, which holds that knowledge terminates in things other than the knower, and so cannot be reduced to a subjective event. Nevertheless, epistemological idealism raises a serious issue, one that Descartes himself tackled with a debatable degree of success. Gallagher expresses it succinctly, quote, "If all of my consciousness initially has the value of a subjective state of my own individual psyche, how do I ever learn the nature of anything other than myself, or even rise to the awareness that there is anything other than myself? If every act of knowing terminates in a purely subjective event, then how can I ever utilize my knowing to arrive at the existence of anything other than myself?" Unquote. Said another way, the problem comes down to surpassing the distinction between appearance and reality. One solution to this problem was developed by the renowned empiricist thinker John Locke. His epistemological position is known as representative realism. Lawhead explains, quote, "Representative realism claims that the mind is directly acquainted only with its own ideas, but that these ideas are caused by and represent objects external to the mind." Unquote. As Gallagher writes, quote, "What my act of awareness immediately terminates in is an idea. but in respect to some of these ideas, we may infer that they correctly represent a feature of reality which is there independent of our awareness." Unquote. This form of realism has been very popular since Locke, especially among scientists. This is seen in common expressions such as, quote, "the sky is not really blue, the apple is not actually sweet, a tree falling in isolation only makes air vibrations, not sound," unquote. According to Locke and those who followed him, primary qualities such as extension, motion, and bulk are objective aspects of the world, whereas secondary qualities such as color, odor, and sound are subjective. This is the epistemological foundation of the scientism of the 19th and 20th centuries. Thus, representative realism attempts to solve Descartes' problem of consciousness and perception by maintaining that our knowledge indirectly reaches the other. Specifically, by examining our subjective impressions of color, odor, sound, etc., we can infer hard facts about the objective world, i.e., the world of atoms in motion. Nevertheless, in spite of its widespread appeal, representative realism has a fatal flaw. In essence, it comes down to the issue of resemblance between ideas and reality. For if our knowledge terminates in ideas, then it would seem impossible to know whether any of our ideas are accurate representations of the real world. In other words, if we only know the copy, how can we compare it to the original? Further, the concept of an idea representing an object is dubious at best. It is unclear how an entirely subjective thought could resemble an objective reality. Hence, as Gallagher writes, quote, "What scientism contends is that my sensations are purely subjective, caused in me by the real objective entities, bodies conceived as science conceives them. But the difficulty will just not down. If my sensations are subjective, then how do I know that there really are bodies independent of them?" Unquote. A second solution to Descartes' problem is that of Immanuel Kant. He maintained that human experiences are composed of two essential elements: the mental categories of human understanding and the noumena, or transcendent reality. This noumena is things as they are in themselves, the reality which is beyond appearances and experiences. According to Kant, the real world is unknowable and unintelligible to us. William Lawhead explains, quote, "Kant says we are confronted with a plurality of sense impressions. By themselves, these sensations would be discrete and unconnected." Unquote. In other words, in and of themselves, sense impressions have no content that we can understand. On their own, they are entirely chaotic and meaningless to us. However, Kant maintains that the world of human experience, what he calls the phenomena, is a world of rational unity. Yet this is not because of the intrinsic intelligibility of the universe. The mind does not conform to objects. Rather, intelligibility, quote, "results from the synthesizing activity of the mind, and objects conform to our knowledge," unquote. In other words, Kant argues that the mind gives shape and meaning to the shapeless, meaningless noumena, thus producing the phenomena. As Lawhead writes, quote, "The understanding actively organizing experience by means of pure concepts or categories," unquote. Hence, Kant attempts to solve the Cartesian epistemological problem by arguing that we do have objective knowledge, but only of things as they appear to us. There is no problem of the mind reaching the non-self if the only non-self which it can reach is that which is shaped by the mind. However, thinkers since Kant have pointed out several inconsistencies in his system. Lawhead explains, quote, "The contents of sensation must be the product of something out there that causes them. Appearances are related to the noumena in some way. But Kant has been criticized here for applying the concept of cause to that which lies outside of experience." Unquote. In other words, it would seem that Kant fails to provide a fully coherent explanation of the relation between noumena and phenomena. Indeed, how can they have any relation at all if relation, as a mental category, does not exist beyond experience? Moreover, the noumena in Kant's system is inherently unknowable to man, yet this appears to be a contradiction. How can one know that something is unknowable? These are two of the most influential attempts to solve Descartes' problem, and over the centuries there have been many others. However, there have been a group of philosophers, including some existentialists, phenomenologists, and Thomists, who have argued that the real problem is with the problem itself. For the Cartesian conception of the self as the isolated thinking thing, and the epistemological idealism which results from it, are not self-evident truths. In other words, Descartes finds that he can doubt everything except his own existence. This is indisputable, but perhaps more is given in this fact than Descartes realized. After all, to claim that I exist is to make a statement about the objective world. It is incoherent to speak of a subject only existing subjectively. As Gallagher writes, it is impossible, quote, to give an empirical meaning to ego or self which excludes all reference to objectivity, unquote. Moreover, the notion that knowledge of the non-self is founded on and subsequent to knowledge of the self is something Descartes assumes rather than proves. In fact, numerous philosophers have asserted the exact opposite, that we first know other beings and then gradually gain self-knowledge through our interaction with others. As Thomas Aquinas writes, quote, "The human intellect is not its own act of understanding, nor is its own essence the first object of its understanding, for this object is the nature of a material thing. And therefore, that which is first known by the human intellect is an object of this kind, and that which is known secondarily is the act by which that object is known, and through the act the intellect itself is known," unquote. Aquinas' ideas are confirmed by the fact that perception often precedes reflection. This is seen in both the development of children and in the difficulty inherent in the maxim, know thyself. For a child's consciousness does not begin in an awareness of itself, of its own ego, and then proceed to become aware of others by comparison. The opposite is true. Similarly, self-knowledge is not immediate or primary. On the contrary, to know oneself can only be accomplished by going out of oneself. Hence, universal human experience indicates that the self can only be understood in relation to the non-self. As Gallagher writes, quote, "It is the other who actually calls us forth into full self-consciousness," unquote. Nonetheless, it is not only empirical evidence that points to this conception of self. The very fact that we are conscious of a distinction between appearances and reality allows us to surpass it. Gallagher writes, quote, "It may be taken as a cardinal principle that that which makes the appearance-reality distinction possible is not itself dubitable," unquote. In other words, while it is possible to doubt the reality or nature of almost everything, that which allows for this wondering doubt is itself beyond doubt. So what is this unquestionable reality? It cannot be the isolated ego of Descartes, but must rather be what Gallagher calls an, quote, openness to the other, unquote. He explains, quote, "It is my existence the questioning being which generates the appearance-reality distinction," unquote. In other words, at the center of my consciousness is nothing less than question, and, quote, "the other is just as present in the question as is the self," unquote. This fact is not only indisputable, it also provides the key to the problem of the other. For that which is given to us as question is ultimately being. No matter what we ask, what we doubt, or what we affirm, we are speaking of being. Though we can wonder what exists, we cannot doubt that something exists. As Gallagher writes, quote, "One thing we may affirm unconditionally is our right to affirm," unquote. We can distinguish between essence and existence and predicate the one of the other. Indeed, the idea of being must necessarily reach even into Kant's noumena. From this it necessarily follows that reality is intelligible. Denying this is self-refuting. We as limited beings may not be able to plumb the depths of reality, but we can confidently say we can have real knowledge of the other. In conclusion, therefore, with this brief examination of the problem of consciousness and several solutions to it, the questions, though far from fully answered, are at least clearer. Descartes, the father of modern philosophy, began with the isolated self and epistemological idealism, and over the following centuries philosophers wrestled with the natural consequence of this, namely the problem of reaching the other, the non-self. Locke offered a representational solution to this difficulty, maintaining that, though the direct objects of consciousness are ideas, many of these ideas accurately represent things in the external world. However, as is now apparent, Locke's answer to Descartes' question is far from satisfactory. For if we never directly experience the objective world, Is it not impossible to know whether our ideas are faithful copies of external objects? Kant's solution, though more comprehensive, does not satisfy either, for the relation of things in themselves to the phenomenal world, as well as the alleged unknowability of the former, are not clearly elucidated in Kant's system. However, there is much more promise in the solution of those thinkers who dispute the Cartesian conception of self. For although it is impossible to deny one's own existence, yet it is also impossible to affirm it as something entirely subjective. To say "I exist" is to claim direct objective knowledge. Moreover, reason and experience both give evidence that the self is only intelligible in contrast with the non-self, and only objective experience can produce self-awareness. This truth entails that the human self is not an isolated entity, but rather a relational being. And finally, the questioning nature of our existence reveals an openness to the non-self, for through the question that is each of us, contact with being is made, and knowledge of being allows us to pass through appearances into reality. With certainty, then, we can affirm the intelligibility of that which is, as well as our ability to have limited but real knowledge of it.